The Draconis Empire made their fatal mistake the day they dismissed humans as a weak, primitive species. That arrogance would be their undoing. In a dingy tavern on planet Zorgax, the air hung thick with smoke and the stench of cheap liquor. Keith Murphy sat in a dark corner, nursing a drink, his eyes scanning the room. He was a smuggler, wanted in a dozen star systems, but right now his attention was fixed on two Draconis warriors at the bar. "Did you hear about our conquest of the Florians?" one of them said, his voice carrying across the room. "Pathetic creatures. They barely put up a fight." The other Draconis, a tall figure with a jagged scar across his face, laughed. "The Draconis Empire will soon rule the entire galaxy. No one can stand against us." Keith gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on his glass. The Florians had been peaceful, no threat to anyone, and now they were gone, wiped out by Draconis cruelty. The scarred Draconis, who seemed to be the leader, spoke again. "I hear there's a species called humans out on the fringe, but they're insignificant. Primitives, they pose no challenge to us." Rage surged through Keith's veins. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The Draconis turned to look at him, their eyes narrowing. "You're wrong," Keith said, his voice low and dangerous. "Humans are stronger than you think, and we don't take kindly to bullies like you." The other scarred Draconis, who Keith heard the other call Captain Speaker, stepped forward until he was toe-to-toe with Keith. "Watch your mouth, human, or I'll add your skull to my collection." Keith didn't flinch, meeting Speaker's gaze with a steely one of his own. For a tense moment it seemed violence would erupt. Then the bartender, a burly four-armed alien, stepped between them. "Take it outside, boys. I won't have any blood spilled in my bar." Speaker sneered but backed away. "This isn't over, human. You and your pathetic species will soon learn your place." Keith watched him go, a cold fury burning in his gut. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. He tossed a credit chip on the table and strode out into the night, his mind already racing with plans. He would show the Draconis the true strength of humanity. He would make Speaker eat his words. But as Keith disappeared into the shadows, he didn't notice the cloaked figure detach itself from the wall and follow him, silent as a ghost. Someone else had taken an interest in the human who dared to defy the Draconis Empire. And on planet Zorgax, interest was a dangerous thing. Back on Earth, news of the Florian genocide sent shockwaves through the government. Admiral Tasha Kerrigan slammed her fist on the table as she stared at the intelligence reports. "This cannot stand," she growled. "The Draconis Empire thinks it can just wipe out entire species with impunity. It's time we taught them a lesson." She turned to her aide. "Get me in touch with every human rebel, mercenary, and smuggler in the Outer Rim. If it's a war the Draconis want, it's a war they'll get." The aide saluted and hurried off. Kerrigan stood at the window, staring out at the stars. It would be a war like the galaxy had never seen. The Draconis thought humans insignificant, but they would soon learn the true meaning of their arrogance. For when humanity united, when it fought for a cause, there was no force in the universe that could stand against it. The Draconis were about to face the full might of an awakened human race. And may the gods have mercy on them, for the humans would not. Keith's boots echoed on the metal grating as he approached the rogue's gambit, his mind still churning with the confrontation at the bar. The cloaked figure from the tavern stepped out of the shadows, causing Keith to instinctively reach for his blaster. "Easy," the figure said, raising his hands. "I mean you no harm." "Who are you?" Keith demanded. "And why are you following me?" The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face that was unmistakably Florian. His skin was a pale blue and his eyes shimmered like liquid silver. "My name is Zephyr," he said. "I'm a Florian rebel and I need your help." Keith's eyes narrowed. "My help? For what?" Zephyr glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Not here. Can we talk inside your ship?" Keith hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He nodded, leading Zephyr up the ramp into the rogue's gambit. Once inside, Zephyr seemed to relax a little. "I heard what you said in the bar about standing up to the Draconis. Did you mean it?" Keith crossed his arms. Every word, but what's it to you? Zephyr leaned forward, his voice urgent. The Draconis didn't just conquer Floria. They enslaved my people to mine Zenite, a rare mineral that's abundant on our planet. They work us to death in those mines. Keith frowned. Zenite was highly valuable, used in advanced technologies. It made sense the Draconis would want it. I managed to escape, Zephyr continued. I've been searching for allies, someone who can help us fight back, and I think humans are the answer.
Why humans? Keith asked.
Your species has a reputation, Zephyr said. For tenacity, for resourcefulness, for not backing down from a fight. That's what we need. Keith leaned back, considering. Getting involved in a rebellion against the Draconis was risky, to say the least. As if sensing his hesitation, Zephyr played his trump card. We can pay you in Zenite. That got Keith's attention. Zenite could fetch a hefty price on the black market, enough to clear the debts that had been dogging him for years. How much Zenite are we talking? Zephyr named a figure that made Keith's eyebrows shoot up. It was a substantial sum, more than he'd ever seen in one place. Keith weighed his options. It was a dangerous proposition, taking on the Draconis Empire, but the payoff was tempting, and if he was honest with himself, the thought of giving the Draconis a black eye held a certain appeal. All right, he said finally. I'm in, but I can't do this alone. We'll need more than just the two of us. Zephyr nodded. I have contacts, other rebels who will join our cause. With your help, we can build a real resistance. Keith grinned, a glint of excitement in his eye. Then let's get started. The Draconis won't know what hit them. As the rogue's gambit lifted off from Zorgax, Keith felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He'd spent years running from his past, taking odd jobs just to stay afloat. But this was a chance to make a real difference. The Draconis thought humans beneath their notice, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Keith set a course for the Outer Rim, to the hidden bases and seedy ports, where he'd find the kind of people this mission required. Smugglers, mercenaries, pilots, anyone with a grudge against the Draconis and the skills to back it up. It was time to assemble a crew, time to take the fight to the Draconis. The rebellion had begun. Keith and Zephyr made their way to Earth, the human homeworld. Keith hadn't set foot on the planet in years, but he had a mission now, and he knew just where to start. Colonel Jack Hawkins lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a large city. When Keith knocked on the door, a gruff voice called out, "Who's there?" "It's Keith Murphy, Jack. I need to talk to you." The door opened, revealing a man in his 60s, with steel-grey hair and a weathered face. "Keith, what are you doing here?" "I need your help, Jack. Can we come in?" Jack eyed Zephyr suspiciously, but stepped aside to let them enter. Once they were seated in the living room, Keith explained the situation with the Draconis and the Florians. Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'm retired, Keith. I'm not sure I'm up for a fight against the Draconis Empire." "They enslaved the Florians, Jack," Keith said. "They're working them to death in Zenite mines. We can't just stand by and let that happen." Jack was silent for a long moment, then he sighed. "All right, I'm in, but we'll need more than just the three of us." "That's why we came to you," Keith said. "We need a team, the best of the best." Jack nodded. "I might know someone who can help. Dr. Ethan Pierce. He's a xenobiologist, one of the foremost experts on alien physiology. If anyone can find a weakness in the Draconis, it's him." They found Dr. Pierce in his high-security lab, surrounded by advanced equipment and specimens from across the galaxy. He was a thin man, with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual look of intense concentration. "Dr. Pierce," Jack said, "we need your help." Pierce looked up from his microscope. "Colonel Hawkins, what brings you here?" They explained the situation, and Pierce's eyes widened. "The Draconis, you're planning to take them on?" "We have to," Keith said. "They're enslaving entire species. We can't let that stand." Pierce was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to his computer. I've been studying the Draconis for years, their physiology, their biology, and I think I may have found something. He brought up a complex diagram on the screen. You see this? It's a gland unique to the Draconis. It regulates their aggression, their strength. If we could find a way to target this gland, to suppress it, we could even the playing field, Jack said. Pierce nodded. Exactly, but it's just a theory. I've never had the chance to test it. Keith leaned forward. This mission could be your chance. We're going to need every advantage we can get against the Draconis. Pierce hesitated, then a slow smile spread across his face. A chance to field test my research and strike a blow against the Draconis empire. How could I refuse? As they left the lab, Keith felt a growing sense of excitement. They had a strategist, a scientist, and a Florian rebel. It was a start. But they would need more. Pilots, fighters, infiltrators. They needed a crew that could take on the Draconis and win. Keith turned to his companions. All right, let's start recruiting. As the rogue's gambit soared through the void of space, Keith couldn't shake the feeling that their mission was about to take an unexpected turn. He sat in the pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the star-studded expanse before him. Zephyr and Jack were deep in discussion about Florian tactics, while Dr. Pierce was engrossed in his research on the Draconis physiology. Suddenly the ship's comms crackled to life. Mayday, Mayday, this is the human cargo ship Prometheus. We are under attack by Draconis raiders, requesting immediate assistance. Keith's heart raced as he grabbed the comms. Prometheus, this is the rogue's gambit. We read you. What's your location? We're in the Antares sector. Coordinates 2.7.5. Please hurry, our shields are failing. Keith glanced at his crew, a silent question in his eyes. They all nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. They couldn't ignore a plea for help, especially from fellow humans. Hold on, Prometheus, we're on our way, Keith said, already plotting a course. The rogue's gambit dropped out of hyperspace into a scene of chaos. The Prometheus, a massive cargo vessel, was besieged by a swarm of Draconis fighter ships. Explosions bloomed across its hull as its shields flickered and died. Keith gripped the controls, his mind focused. Jack, get on the guns. Zephyr, divert power to the engines. We're going in hot. The rogue's gambit dived into the fray, its weapons blazing. Jack whooped as he targeted the Draconis ships, his shots finding their mark with deadly precision. Keith wove the ship through the chaos, dodging enemy fire and debris. The Prometheus is launching escape pods, Zephyr called out. Cover them, Keith ordered. We can't let the Draconis take prisoners. It was a fierce battle, the rogue's gambit darting and weaving, its guns never falling silent. But slowly the tide turned. The Draconis ships fell back, their numbers dwindling under the onslaught. As the last enemy ship exploded into a ball of fire, Keith let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Status report? Shields are holding at 50%, Zephyr reported. Minor damage to the hull, but nothing critical. The Prometheus is hailing us, Jack said. Keith nodded. On screen. The view screen flickered to life, revealing a man in a military uniform. He had a square jaw and piercing blue eyes, his posture rigid even as relief softened his features. This is Sergeant Max Reiner of the Prometheus. I can't thank you enough for your assistance. Keith leaned forward. Sergeant Reiner, I'm Keith Murphy of the Rogue's Gambit. What's a human cargo ship doing out here in Draconis space? Reiner hesitated, glancing off-screen as if consulting with someone. When he turned back, there was a new intensity in his gaze. We're not just any cargo ship. We're transporting a special unit, genetically enhanced soldiers, Project Prometheus. Keith's eyebrows shot up. Genetically enhanced soldiers. He'd heard rumors of such programs but had always dismissed them as fantasy. We were on a covert mission, gathering intel on Draconis military installations, Reiner continued, but we were ambushed. If you hadn't arrived when you did. What's your mission now? Keith asked. To get this intel back to Earth, but our ship is crippled. We won't make it far. An idea formed in Keith's mind. Sergeant, we're on a mission of our own to liberate Floria from the Draconis. Reiner's eyes widened. Floria, that's no easy task. No, it isn't, but it's necessary. The Draconis are enslaving the Florians, forcing them to mine Xenite. We could use your help. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Reiner's face. A chance to strike back at the Draconis and free an enslaved people. Project Prometheus is at your service. Keith grinned. Welcome aboard, Sergeant. Let's show the Draconis what humans are made of. As the Prometheus crew transferred over to the Rogue's Gambit, Keith couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. With these enhanced soldiers on their side, with their insider knowledge of Draconis tactics, their odds of success had just shot up. But deep down he knew this was just the beginning. The Draconis would not give up Floria without a fight, and with each strike against them the risk of retaliation grew. They were poking a sleeping giant, and when it awoke the entire galaxy would tremble. The Rogue's Gambit touched down on Floria, its hull still bearing the scars of the battle with the Draconis raiders. As the ramp lowered, Keith and his crew were greeted by a group of Florian rebels, their faces etched with a mix of hope and desperation. Zephyr, a female Florian with striking violet eyes exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace him. Asha, Zephyr replied, his voice thick with emotion. It's good to see you. Asha turned to Keith and the others. Thank you for coming. We've been fighting the Draconis for so long, but our numbers are dwindling. We need your help. As they followed Asha into the rebel base, a network of caves hidden deep in the Florian mountains, she filled them in on the situation. Governor Malgax, a sadistic Draconis, known for his cruelty, had been pushing the Florian miners to their limits. Accidents were common, and those who couldn't keep up were simply left to die in the dark, damp tunnels. He's a monster, Asha spat. He takes pleasure in our suffering. In the war room, a holographic map of the Xenite mines glowed before them. Zephyr pointed to a section. There, he said, that's our way in. A series of ventilation shafts too small for the Draconis to patrol. Sergeant Reiner leaned in, studying the map. My Prometheus soldiers can take point. Our enhanced senses will allow us to navigate the tunnels and detect any Draconis presence. Keith nodded. All right, Zephyr, you and Asha guide us through. Dr. Pierce, be ready. We don't know what condition we'll find the miners in. As they geared up, the weight of their mission hung heavy in the air. They were about to infiltrate the heart of Draconis operations on Floria. The stakes couldn't be higher. The ventilation shafts were a tight fit, even for the lithe Florians. They moved in silence, the only sound the scrape of their gear against the metal walls. Sergeant Reiner's soldiers took the lead, their eyes glinting in the dim light, their movements precise and calculated. And then they emerged into hell. The Xenite mine was a cavernous expanse, lit by harsh artificial light. The air was thick with dust and the stench of sweat and despair, and everywhere Florians toiled. They were skeletal figures, their once vibrant skin dulled by grime and exhaustion. Many bore the marks of the Draconis overseer's whips. Some looked barely old enough to be out of childhood. My God, Dr. Pierce breathed. This is inhuman. Asha's face was hard as stone. This is what the Draconis do. This is what they are. They moved through the mine, sticking to the shadows, documenting the horrors they saw. Dr. Pierce collected samples, his face growing more and more grim. And then they found the children. In a sectioned-off area of the mine, Florian youngsters were strapped to gurneys, IVs dripping unknown substances into their veins. They whimpered and cried out, their small bodies racked with pain. They're experimenting on them, Dr. Pierce said, his voice shaking with rage, trying to splice their DNA to create enhanced Draconis soldiers. Keith's hand tightened on his blaster. Not anymore. The rescue was swift and brutal. Sergeant Reiner's soldiers moved like ghosts, dispatching the Draconis guards with cold efficiency. Keith and the others freed the children, Dr. Pierce tending to their wounds. As they led the children out, Zephyr paused at the entrance to the lab. His eyes met Keith's, a silent understanding passing between them. Zephyr tossed a grenade into the room, the explosion shaking the very foundations of the mine. Alarms blared as they raced through the tunnels, the freed Florian miners following close behind. They burst out into the open air, the rogue's gambit waiting, its engines roaring to life. But as they took off, a menacing figure emerged from the smoke and rubble. Governor Malgax, his eyes burning with rage, his clawed hand pointing at the fleeing ship. "You think you've won, humans?" he roared. "You think you can defy the Draconis Empire and live? I will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy. I will make you suffer in ways you cannot imagine. This rebellion will be crushed, and you will be the first to fall." As the rogue's gambit soared into the sky, Keith looked back at the receding figure of Malgax. The governor's words echoed in his mind, a chilling promise of retribution. But Keith's commitment only hardened. They had struck a blow against the Draconis today, had shown that even the most powerful empire had weaknesses. The battle for Floria, for the very fate of humanity and all alien species, had only just begun. And Keith and his crew would be there, fighting on the front lines until the very end. Back at the rebel base, Keith and his team huddled around a holographic map of the Draconis stronghold. They'd been hitting the Zenite mines hard, freeing Florians and sabotaging equipment, but they knew they needed a decisive blow to truly turn the tide. "If we can take out this command center," Zephyr said, pointing to a heavily fortified structure, "we can cripple their operations on Floria." Keith nodded. "We'll need to coordinate our forces, hit them from multiple angles at once." Just then a rebel scout burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem, a big one." He brought up a new image on the hologram, a massive Draconis warship dripping with weapons. "That's the Draconis flagship," Asha said, her voice tight. "What's it doing here?" "It's Governor Malgax," the scout reported. "He's called for reinforcements from the homeworld. That ship is carrying an elite unit, led by Captain Spiker himself." The room fell silent. They all knew Spiker by reputation, a ruthless warrior fiercely loyal to the Draconis cause. Keith's mind raced. If Spiker and his elite soldiers joined the fight, their chances of victory would plummet. They needed to act fast, before the reinforcements could fully deploy. An idea formed in his mind, a desperate gamble. He turned to Zephyr. "The Draconis value personal combat, right? As a way of settling disputes?" Zephyr nodded. "It's a core part of their warrior culture. They believe that the strongest should lead." Keith took a deep breath. "Then I challenge Spiker to a duel, one-on-one. If I win, his forces stand down and leave Floria." The room erupted into protests. "Keith, no," Asha said. "Spiker is a monster. He'll kill you." "You can't do this," Jack agreed. "We need you leading the charge, not risking your life in some duel." But Keith's mind was made up. "This is our best shot. If I can take Spiker down, it'll demoralize his troops, maybe even make some of them question the Draconis way." He turned to Dr. Pierce. "That biological weakness you found, can you weaponize it?" Dr. Pierce hesitated, then nodded. "I've been working on a compound. It should weaken their scales, make them vulnerable. But Keith, it's untested." "It's a risk we have to take," Keith said. He turned to the others. "This is our chance to prove that humans are more than the Draconis think, that we're a force to be reckoned with." Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded. They knew the stakes, knew that this could be their only chance. The challenge was sent, and Spiker accepted with a sneer. The duel would take place at dawn in the shadow of the Draconis stronghold. As the sun rose over the barren landscape, Keith stepped forward, his heart pounding. He wore a lightweight combat suit, reinforced with Zenite alloy. At his hip, a plasma blade hummed with barely contained energy, its hilt concealing Dr. Pierce's biological agent. Spiker emerged from the stronghold, his black scales glinting in the morning light. He was a head taller than Keith, his muscles rippling under his armor. "I remember you, human," Spiker growled. "From the bar on Zorgax, you should have learned your place then." Keith smiled tightly. "I'm a slow learner." They circled each other, their eyes locked. In the distance, Keith could see the rebel forces, could feel their hopes and fears resting on his shoulders. Speaker moved first, his claws slashing at Keith's face with blinding speed. Keith dodged, rolling under the blow and coming up behind the Draconis. His blade lashed out, but Speaker's scales turned it aside. They traded blows, parrying and thrusting, their movements a deadly dance. Speaker was strong, far stronger than any human, but Keith was quick and agile, using his smaller size to his advantage. But as the duel wore on, Keith could feel himself tiring. Speaker seemed to be barely winded, his attacks coming faster and harder. A blow caught Keith in the chest, sending him sprawling. He tasted blood, felt a rib crack. Spiker loomed over him, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Yield, human, you're beaten." Keith's hand closed around the hilt of his blade. "Not yet." He thumbed a switch on the hilt, and the blade glowed a sickly green. Speaker's eyes widened in surprise as Keith lunged forward, driving the blade into a gap in the Draconis' armor. Speaker roared in pain, staggering back. The biological agent was doing its work, eating through his scales, weakening him. Keith pressed his advantage, his blade flashing. He could see the fear in Speaker's eyes now, the realization that he might lose. With a final desperate effort, Keith drove his blade into Speaker's chest. The Draconis fell, his eyes wide with shock. A hush fell over the battlefield. Then slowly a cheer began to build among the rebel forces. The humans had won. Keith had won. As medics rushed to tend to Keith's wounds, he saw something new in the eyes of the Draconis soldiers. Respect. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of doubt. They had struck a blow today, not just against Speaker, but against the very idea of Draconis superiority. They had shown that humans and Florians were a force to be reckoned with. But as Keith looked to the horizon, he knew their fight was just the beginning. Governor Malgax would be enraged by this defeat. He would strike back, harder than ever. They had won a battle, but the war for Floria, for the very soul of the galaxy, was just beginning. As the rebel forces rallied, their spirits bolstered by Keith's triumph over Spiker, they prepared for the final push against the Draconis stronghold. Colonel Hawkins gathered a strike team, his weathered face set with unyielding commitment. "We'll hit them hard and fast," he said, his voice carrying over the assembled rebels. "Draw their fire, keep them focused on us. That'll give Keith and the Prometheus team their opening." Keith nodded, checking his gear one last time. The neural disruptor felt heavy at his hip, an untested weapon that could be their last hope. They moved out as dawn broke over the horizon, the rebel forces splitting into two groups. Hawkins and his team approached the stronghold from the front, weapons blazing, while Keith, Sergeant Reiner, and the Prometheus soldiers slipped in through a side entrance. The corridors were eerily quiet as they made their way deeper into the compound, the only sound the soft tread of their boots on the metal floor. Then, as they rounded a corner, all hell broke loose. Draconis guards swarmed from every direction, their energy weapons lighting up the dim hallway. Keith and his team responded in kind, plasma bolts and laser fire crisscrossing in a deadly web. Sergeant Reiner was a force of nature, his enhanced reflexes and strength making him a blur of motion. He tore through the Draconis ranks, his hands and feet striking with brutal efficiency. Keith fought at his side, his plasma blade humming as it sliced through Draconis armor. They pushed forward step by bloody step, the Prometheus soldiers forming a tight phalanx around them. At last they stood before the governor's chamber, the door sealed and reinforced. Keith nodded to one of the Prometheus soldiers, who stepped forward and placed a breaching charge. The explosion rocked the corridor, smoke billowing as the door crumpled inward. Keith charged through, blade at the ready, Sergeant Reiner and the others close behind. But what they found inside made them skid to a halt. Governor Malgax stood in the center of the room, his clawed hand wrapped around Zephyr's throat. The Florian rebel looked battered and bruised, his eyes wide with fear. "Drop your weapons," Malgax snarled, "or the Florian dies." Keith hesitated, his grip tightening on his blade. He could see the madness in Malgax's eyes, the desperation of a tyrant backed into a corner. "You're finished, Malgax," Keith said, his voice steady. "Your forces are beaten. Surrender now, and you may yet live." Malgax laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you've won, human? You think your little biological trick will save you?" He reached into his armor, pulling out a vial of glowing blue liquid. "We know about your weapon, and we've developed a countermeasure. One injection of this, and your advantage is gone." Keith's blood ran cold. If Malgax was telling the truth, if the Draconis could neutralize Dr. Pierce's weapon— Sergeant Reiner caught Keith's eye, a silent communication passing between them. Slowly, carefully, Reiner reached for the neural disruptor at his hip. "Last chance, Malgax," Keith said, his voice tight. "Let Zephyr go and no one else needs to get hurt." Malgax sneered, his claws digging into Zephyr's flesh. "You dare give me orders, human? I'll tear his throat out before I—" Sergeant Reiner moved faster than the eye could follow. The neural disruptor whined as it charged, and then a pulse of energy burst forth, engulfing Malgax. The Draconis governor stiffened, his eyes rolling back in his head. His grip on Zephyr slackened, and the Florian fell to the floor, gasping for air. Keith was moving before Malgax hit the ground, his blade flashing out. It struck the vial in Malgax's hand, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by Zephyr's ragged breathing. Then Keith was helping him to his feet, supporting his weight. "It's over," Keith said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and relief. "We did it." But even as the words left his mouth, a tremor shook the compound. Dust rained down from the ceiling and alarms began to blare. Sergeant Reiner checked his scanner, his face grim. "The reactor core, it's going critical. Malgax must have triggered a self-destruct." Keith's heart raced. They had minutes, maybe less, before the whole place went up in a ball of plasma. "We need to move," he said, already heading for the door. "Hawkins, do you read me? The compound is about to blow. Get your people clear now." Static crackled over the comm, then Hawkins' voice broke through. "Copy that, Keith. We're pulling back, but you better hurry. This place is coming down fast." They ran, Zephyr leaning heavily on Keith, the Prometheus soldiers forming a rearguard. The corridors were filled with smoke and the stench of burning circuitry, the floor bucking beneath their feet. They burst out into the open air, the rebel forces already retreating, Hawkins waving them on. Behind them, the Draconi stronghold shuddered, cracks racing up its walls. They were 100 yards out when it blew, a massive fireball rising into the sky, the shockwave knocking them off their feet. Keith rolled, shielding Zephyr with his body, debris raining down around them. And then it was over. The stronghold was a smoking ruin, the Draconis forces scattered and leaderless. Keith stood helping Zephyr to his feet. Around them the rebels were cheering, their voices rising in a ragged chorus. They had won. Floria was free. But as Keith looked out over the war-torn landscape, he knew their fight was just getting started. The Draconis Empire would not forget this defeat. They would come again, with greater force, greater fury. But they would be ready. Humans and Florians united against a common foe. For now, though, they would celebrate. They would tend to their wounded, mourn their dead. And they would prepare for the battles to come. Keith's mind raced as he stared down Governor Malgax, his grip tightening on his plasma blade. He had to buy time for Dr. Pierce to ready the neural disruptor, but one wrong move could mean Zephyr's life. "You're finished, Malgax," Keith said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Your forces are beaten, your stronghold is falling. Surrender now, and you might just survive this." Malgax's eyes narrowed, his claws digging into Zephyr's flesh. "You dare threaten me, human? I hold the power here. One twitch of my hand, and your Florian friend's blood will decorate these walls." Behind Malgax, Dr. Pierce worked feverishly, his fingers flying over the neural disruptor's controls. Just a few more seconds. Keith took a step forward, drawing Malgax's attention. "You're right, you do have power. The power to make a choice, the Draconis way, or a new path, one of peace, of coexistence." Malgax scoffed. Peace? With inferior species like you and the Florians? The Draconis Empire will never stoop so low. The Empire is crumbling, Keith pressed. You've seen it yourself. The cracks are forming. How long before it shatters completely? Malgax's grip on Zephyr loosened just a fraction, his eyes flickering with doubt. It was the opening they needed. Dr. Pierce activated the neural disruptor, a pulse of energy washing over Malgax and his guards. They stiffened, their bodies going rigid as their nervous systems short-circuited. Sergeant Reiner moved, a blur of motion. In seconds he had disarmed Malgax and pulled Zephyr to safety. Keith was right behind him, snapping restraints onto the paralyzed governor. "It's over, Malgax," Keith said, his voice hard. "Floria is free." Cheers erupted from the Florian rebels as they stormed the stronghold, securing the remaining Draconis forces. The air was electric, with the taste of victory, of hope reborn. But even as they celebrated, a new threat loomed on the horizon. A Draconis fleet dropped out of hyperspace, hundreds of ships filling the sky. At their head was a vessel larger and more menacing than any Keith had ever seen. "The Emperor's flagship," Zephyr whispered, his face going pale. "He's here." A hologram flickered to life, the image of the Draconis Emperor towering over them. His scales were a deep obsidian black, his eyes burning with malice. "Rebels of Floria," the Emperor's voice boomed, "you have committed an act of war against the Draconis Empire. Surrender now, return Governor Malgax, and your deaths will be swift. Resist, and you will suffer as no species has suffered before." Keith stepped forward, meeting the Emperor's gaze. "We will never surrender. Floria belongs to the Florians, not to you. Not anymore." The Emperor's face contorted with rage. "Then you have sealed your fate, and the fate of every world that stands with you. The Draconis Empire will not rest until every last rebel is nothing more than ashes scattered on the solar winds." The hologram winked out, and the Draconis fleet began to advance, their weapons charging. Keith turned to his team, to the Florian rebels, who looked to him with a mix of fear and willpower. They were outnumbered, outgunned. The odds were stacked against them in every way. But they had something the Draconis would never understand. They had something worth fighting for, worth dying for. "This is it," Keith said, his voice carrying across the assembled forces. "This is our moment, our chance to strike a blow for freedom that will be felt across the galaxy. The Draconis think they can crush us, can break our spirit, but they're wrong." He raised his plasma blade, the blue light casting his face in sharp relief. "So today we show them the strength of unity, of humans and Florians, standing together against tyranny. Today we fight not just for Floria, but for every world that dreams of throwing off the shackles of oppression." A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of defiance, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Keith turned to face the oncoming fleet, his team at his side. "For Floria," he shouted, his voice joining the chorus. "For freedom!" And with that they charged, racing towards an uncertain future, towards a battle that would echo through the ages. The war for the soul of the galaxy had begun. As the Draconis fleet loomed menacingly in the skies above Floria, Keith's comm crackled to life. "Keith, this is Admiral Tasha Kerrigan from Earth Command. Do you read me?" Keith's eyes widened in surprise. "Admiral Kerrigan, I read you. What's going on?" "The United Earth Council has been monitoring your situation. We've seen the bravery and willpower of you and your team, and we cannot stand by while the Draconis Empire threatens the freedom of the galaxy." A glimmer of hope sparked in Keith's chest. "What are you saying, Admiral?" "I'm saying that you're about to have some company. The cavalry's coming, Keith." As if on cue, a massive wormhole tore open the fabric of space, and through it emerged a sight that made Keith's heart soar. A human fleet, larger and more advanced than any he had ever seen, poured into the Florian system. The Draconis Emperor's face contorted with shock and rage on the screen. "What is this? Where did they come from?" Keith grinned, a fierce joy flooding through him. "You made a big mistake, Emperor. You thought humans were weak, insignificant. But when we unite, When we stand together, there's nothing we can't do. The human ships fell into formation alongside the rebel forces, their weapons primed and ready. On the bridge of the lead ship, Admiral Kerrigan stood tall and proud. "This is Admiral Kerrigan to all ships. Our objective is to defend Floria and its people from Draconis aggression. Engage the enemy, but watch your fire. There are friendlies out there." As the two fleets closed in, the void of space erupted with the fury of 1,000 suns. Laser fire and plasma bolts crisscrossed the black, shields flaring and hulls buckling under the onslaught. In the midst of the chaos, Keith and his team weaved through the battle, striking at key Draconis ships with precision and skill. Colonel Hawkins' voice crackled over the comm, directing the human fleet with the wisdom of a seasoned strategist. "Red Squadron, focus fire on that dreadnought's engines. Blue Squadron, screen our bombers as they make their run." In the lab of the Rogue's Gambit, Dr. Pierce worked feverishly, sweat beading on his brow. "The Draconis countermeasure is based on a viral inhibitor," he muttered, his fingers flying over the console. "If I can just find a way to bypass it." Sergeant Reiner burst onto the bridge, his face lit with a fierce grin. "Doc, I hope you got something good. We're about to board the Emperor's flagship." Dr. Pierce looked up, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "I've got it. A modified strain of the biological agent. It should cut through their defenses seamlessly." Reiner clapped him on the shoulder. "Then let's get it loaded up. We've got an Emperor to dethrone." As the Rogue's Gambit docked with the Draconis flagship, Keith and his team stormed the corridors, Prometheus soldiers at their side. They fought their way through the ship, the modified biological agent proving devastatingly effective against the Draconis guards. At last, they stood before the doors of the Emperor's throne room. Keith glanced at his team, seeing the commitment etched on every face. "This is it," he said. "No turning back now." With a nod to Sergeant Reiner, they blasted the doors open and charged inside, weapons blazing. The Emperor rose from his throne, his eyes burning with hate. "You dare to challenge me, I who have conquered 1,000 worlds." Keith leveled his plasma blade at the Emperor's chest. "Your reign of terror ends today. Surrender, and your life will be spared." The Emperor laughed, a cruel mocking sound. "Surrender to a lowly human? I would rather die." "That can be arranged," Sergeant Reiner growled, his rifle trained on the Emperor's head. But before anyone could move, a blinding light filled the throne room. A hologram flickered to life, the image of Admiral Kerrigan towering above them. "Emperor of the Draconis," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I am Admiral Tasha Kerrigan of the United Earth Fleet. Your forces are in disarray, your flagship surrounded. You have no choice but to stand down." The Emperor snarled, his claws flexing. But as he looked around the room at the guns pointed at him from every angle, at the resolute faces of the humans and rebels, something in his eyes seemed to break. "I will not surrender," he hissed, "but perhaps a truce, a negotiation." Keith exchanged a glance with his team. They had come so far, fought so hard. Could they trust the word of a tyrant? But as he looked at the Emperor, he saw not a conqueror but a broken ruler. His dreams of empire shattered. Perhaps with time and diplomacy, even the Draconis could change. "A truce," Keith said, lowering his blade, "but on our terms. Floria will be free, its people liberated, and the Draconis will withdraw from all occupied worlds." The Emperor's heart made, but slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "So be it. The Draconis Empire will honor this agreement." As the Emperor spoke those words, a cheer went up from the rebel forces, from the human fleet, from every corner of the Florian system. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought the mighty Draconis Empire to its knees. Keith felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Zephyr, his eyes shining with tears of joy. "Thank you," the Florian said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving us back our world." Keith smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "We couldn't have done it without you, Zephyr, without all of you. This victory belongs to all of us." As the Rogue's Gambit pulled away from the Draconis flagship, Keith looked out at the stars, at the endless possibilities that stretched before them. They had won a great battle today, but he knew the war was nowhere near the end. There would be other threats, other tyrants to face, but as long as humans and aliens stood together, as long as they fought for what was right, Keith knew they would never be defeated. The Rogue's Gambit set a course for Earth, for a hero's welcome and a new chapter in the story of the galaxy. And as they flew towards the rising sun, Keith felt a sense of hope, of purpose, that he had never known before. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as friends, as allies, as a united force for good. And may the stars have mercy on anyone who tried to stand in their way. The battle aboard the Emperor's flagship raged with a ferocity Keith had never seen before. Plasma bolts scorched the air, the acrid stench of burning metal filling the corridors. Sergeant Reiner led the charge, his Prometheus soldiers cutting through the Draconis guards easily. "Push forward," Reiner roared, his rifle spitting death with every squeeze of the trigger. "We're almost to the bridge." Keith was right behind him, his plasma blade a blur of blue light. They fought their way through the ship, the Draconis falling before their relentless onslaught. At last they burst onto the bridge, the Emperor himself rising from his command throne. His eyes burned with a hatred so intense it seemed to sear the very air. "Who you dare to challenge me on my own ship?" he snarled, his claws flexing. "I will flay the flesh from your bones." But Sergeant Reiner was already moving, a blur of motion. He slammed into the Emperor, knocking him off balance. They grappled, claws against fists, in a brutal dance of death. Keith and the other Prometheus soldiers engaged the Emperor's elite guard, the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded filling the bridge. It was a battle that seemed to stretch for an eternity, but in reality lasted only minutes. And when it was over, the Emperor lay at Sergeant Reiner's feet, beaten and bloody. "It's over," Reiner growled, his rifle aimed at the Emperor's head. "Surrender and your life will be spared." The Emperor looked around at his fallen guards, at the guns pointed at him from every angle, and in his eyes Keith saw something he never thought he'd see in a Draconis. Defeat. "I yield," the Emperor rasped, his voice thick with pain and humiliation. "The Draconis Empire surrenders to the human alliance." But even as the words left his mouth, Sergeant Reiner staggered, his rifle clattering to the floor. Keith rushed to his side, horror dawning as he saw the extent of Reiner's wounds. The sergeant's armor was scorched and shattered, blood seeping from a dozen deep gashes. Around them, the other Prometheus soldiers lay where they had fallen, their lives given in the final desperate assault. "We did it," Reiner whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of broken machinery. "We won." Keith clasped his hand, tears stinging his eyes. "Yes, we did. Thanks to you and all the brave souls who fought beside us." As the Draconis forces laid down their arms and the ceasefire took hold, Keith received a transmission from the surface of Floria. It was Asha, her face streaked with tears and grime. "Keith," she said, her voice breaking, "it's Zephyr. He didn't make it." The words hit Keith like a physical blow. Zephyr, the brave Florian rebel who had started it all, who had brought them together for this fight, gone. "What happened?" he managed, his throat tight with grief. "He was in the capital city, helping to evacuate civilians. A building collapsed and he got the children out, but—" She couldn't finish, her sobs echoing over the comlink. Keith closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all they had lost pressing down on him. So many brave souls, human and Florian alike, had given their lives for this victory, and now, with the fighting over, it fell to him to ensure their sacrifices were not in vain. In the days that followed, as the Draconis forces withdrew and the Florian people began to rebuild, Keith worked tirelessly with the United Earth Council and the newly formed Florian government to hammer out the details of the peace treaty. It was a monumental task, untangling the web of Draconis oppression and establishing a new fair system for all. But step by step, with patience and willpower, they made progress. The Draconis Empire was dismantled, its conquered territories granted independence, and the chance to join the new Galactic Alliance as equal partners. The Zenite mines were returned to Florian control, with strict regulations put in place to ensure the safety and fair treatment of the workers. And throughout it all, Keith held tight to the memory of those they had lost. Zephyr, Sergeant Reiner, the fallen Prometheus soldiers, and Florian rebels. Their courage and sacrifice would never be forgotten. As the Rogue's Gambit prepared to depart Floria, its mission complete, Keith stood before a crowd of thousands, humans and Florians alike. They had gathered to honor the heroes of the rebellion, to pay tribute to those who had fallen. "Today we stand united," Keith said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Humans and Florians, once strangers, now brothers and sisters in arms. We have faced the darkness together, and together we have triumphed." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "But let us never forget the price of that triumph. Let us remember the brave souls who gave their lives so that we might stand here today, free and united. Their sacrifice will forever be etched in the heart of this galaxy." As the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, Keith felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Colonel Hawkins, his face lined with both pride and sorrow. "You did good, son," he said. "Zephyr would be proud." Keith nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "I know, but this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done." Hawkins smiled, a glint of the old fire in his eyes. "Then let's get to it, Captain Murphy. The galaxy awaits." As the Rogue's Gambit lifted off, the lush green forests of Floria falling away beneath them, Keith looked out at the stars, at the infinite possibilities that stretched before them. The Draconis threat had been quelled, but he knew that new challenges would arise. There would always be those who sought to oppress, to conquer, to dominate. But there would also always be those who stood against them, those who fought for freedom, for justice, for the right of all species to live in peace. And as long as there were people like Zephyr, like Sergeant Reiner, like the brave men and women of the Prometheus Project and the Florian Rebellion, as long as there were humans willing to stand up and fight for what was right, then the galaxy would never truly be without hope. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.